The salt air hung heavy over the churning waters of the Pacific, 3 miles north of Midway Atoll. On the morning of June 5, 1942, the sun had barely cleared the horizon when Petty Officer First Class Takeshi Yamamoto felt the American .50 caliber rounds tear through the fuselage of his Mitsubishi A6M0. The aircraft shuddered violently, metal screaming against metal, and within seconds, black smoke poured from the engine cowling. He knew the mathematics of his situation with cold precision. Altitude dropping, engine dead, ocean rising. There was no choice. He pulled the canopy release, felt the violent rush of wind, and ejected into the vast emptiness of the Pacific sky. The parachute opened with a jarring snap that sent pain shooting through his already injured shoulder. Below him, the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a blue desert that cared nothing for empires or ideologies. He hit the water hard. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, and for a terrifying moment, he thrashed in his flight suit, weighted down by sodden fabric and equipment. Then training took over. He inflated his life vest, gasping, treading water, watching his Zero spiral down in its final dive, and disappear beneath the waves with barely a ripple. He was alone. The battle continued somewhere over the horizon, marked by distant columns of smoke and the faint thunder of explosions. And then, perhaps 30 minutes later, he heard the sound of an engine. Not the high whine of a Zero, but the deeper, steadier growl of an American patrol boat. What happened in the hours that followed would shatter everything Takeshi Yamamoto had been taught about his enemy, about honor, and about the nature of the war itself. The American vessel approached cautiously, sailors on deck with rifles trained on him, but they did not fire. They pulled him from the water with rough efficiency, stripped him of his flight suit, and bound his hands. He expected interrogation, perhaps torture, certainly contempt. He had been prepared for death since the moment he joined the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Death was acceptable. What came next was not something his training had prepared him for at all. An American sailor, no older than Yamamoto himself, knelt beside him on the deck and began examining his wounds with careful, almost gentle hands. The shoulder injury was worse than he'd realized, the bullet having passed through muscle and chipped bone. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandage another sailor had already applied, and then the medic arrived. His name was Robert Chun, a Chinese-American corpsman from San Francisco, and he carried a leather medical kit that seemed impossibly well-stocked. Chun didn't speak Japanese, and Yamamoto's English was limited to a handful of aviation terms, but language proved unnecessary. Chun's hands moved with professional competence, cleaning the wound, administering morphine, applying sulfur powder to prevent infection, and wrapping the shoulder in clean white gauze. The entire time, Yamamoto waited for the cruelty to begin, for the performance of mercy to end, and the real treatment to commence. It never did. Chun finished bandaging the shoulder, checked Yamamoto's other injuries, a gash on his forehead, and bruised ribs, and then did something that made no sense whatsoever. He moved to a wounded American sailor lying 3 feet away, a young man who'd been burned in an earlier engagement, and began the same careful process of cleaning, medicating, and bandaging. But the American sailor was conscious, in obvious pain, and the medic had just spent 20 minutes treating an enemy pilot first. Yamamoto's mind struggled to process this inversion of every principle he'd been taught. The wounded American sailor met his eyes briefly, and there was no hatred there, only exhaustion and pain and a kind of resigned recognition that both of them were simply young men bleeding on the same deck. This moment, repeated thousands of times across the vast theater of the Pacific War, represented a collision not just of armies, but of entirely incompatible philosophies about human value, military honor, and the very purpose of warfare itself. To understand why this experience proved so psychologically devastating to Japanese servicemen like Yamamoto, one must first understand the ideological architecture that shaped their expectations. The Japanese military indoctrination system of the early 1940s was built upon ancient Bushido warrior codes filtered through modern ultranationalism and emperor worship. Soldiers and pilots were taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, worse than death, a stain upon family and nation that could never be cleansed. The Senjinkan military code, issued in 1941, stated explicitly, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a bad name." This was not mere rhetoric. It was enforced through ritual, repetition, and the systematic dehumanization of the enemy. American and British forces were portrayed as decadent, cruel, spiritually weak creatures who would torture and execute prisoners without hesitation. Japanese training films showed dramatized scenes of Allied soldiers bayoneting wounded Japanese, laughing while they did so. These images were not presented as war propaganda, but as documentary of fact, is simple truth about the nature of the enemy. Every pilot, every soldier, every sailor internalized a simple equation: capture equals torture equals death. Better to die in battle or take one's own life than fall into enemy hands. This belief system was reinforced by the treatment Japan accorded to its own prisoners. The Bushido Code demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor, and those who surrendered, whether Japanese or enemy, had demonstrated a fundamental character flaw that placed them outside the protection of honorable conduct. Japanese forces across Asia and the Pacific treated captured soldiers with systematic brutality, not out of sadism, though that certainly occurred, but out of genuine ideological conviction that these men had forfeited their humanity through the act of surrender. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the Manila Massacre. These were not aberrations but logical extensions of a worldview in which the weak deserved no mercy, and surrender was proof of weakness. When Japanese soldiers bayoneted wounded American prisoners or worked captured Allied servicemen to death in labor camps, they were acting in accordance with a moral framework that made perfect internal sense. Strength was sacred. Weakness was contemptible. The emperor's will was absolute. Within this framework, mercy toward the defeated was not virtue, but a dangerous sentimentality that weakened the warrior spirit. So when Takeshi Yamamoto, drifting in his life vest in the Pacific, saw that American patrol boat approaching, his mind immediately supplied the ending to this story. He would be pulled aboard, beaten for information, and when he proved useless, killed. Perhaps they would make it theatrical. Perhaps they would simply shoot him and throw his body back into the ocean. What he absolutely did not expect was medical treatment administered with the same care they would give their own wounded. That inversion of expectation created a cognitive dissonance so profound that many Japanese prisoners, in the days and weeks following their capture, experienced something resembling psychological breakdown. The foundational narratives that had organized their entire understanding of the war simply collapsed. If the enemy was not bestial, if the enemy treated prisoners with medical care and basic dignity, if the enemy valued even enemy life enough to expend resources keeping prisoners alive, then what did that say about the stories they'd been told? What did that say about their own military's treatment of prisoners? These questions were dangerous, not because they were difficult to answer, but because the answers undermined the entire ideological structure of the Japanese war effort. The pattern repeated across thousands of engagements. On Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers who expected execution received food, water, and medical attention. American medics, following the Geneva Conventions that the United States had signed and Japan had not, treated enemy wounded according to triage protocols based on medical need, not national allegiance. This was not sentimentality. It was policy, rooted in international law and American military doctrine. But to Japanese servicemen raised on tales of American barbarism, it was incomprehensible. Documentation from American medical units throughout the Pacific reveals the shock on Japanese prisoners' faces when they realized they would actually receive treatment. One Army medic stationed in the Philippines wrote in his diary, "Pulled 3 Jap soldiers out of a bunker today, all wounded. They were crying, actually crying, and trying to pull away from us. Thought we were taking them somewhere to kill them. When the doc started working on the worst one first, they just went silent, couldn't process it." Another account, from a Navy corpsman at Leyte Gulf, describes treating a Japanese pilot with severe burns. "He kept waiting for the pain for us to hurt him on purpose. Kept flinching every time I touched him like he thought the care was a setup for something worse. When I finished bandaging him and gave him water, he just stared at the canteen like it might be poisoned. It wasn't. It was just water." The medical treatment represented more than simple humanitarian policy. It was a manifestation of a fundamentally different conception of human value. American military culture, for all its flaws and contradictions, operated within a framework inherited from Enlightenment philosophy and Judeo-Christian ethics that recognized some baseline of human dignity that even enemies possessed. This didn't prevent atrocities. The Pacific War saw plenty of American war crimes, but it created a default assumption that prisoners were still human beings, with rights, however limited. The Japanese military system, by contrast, operated within a framework where humanity was conditional, earned through loyalty and sacrifice, and forfeited through surrender. The collision of these two systems in the person of wounded prisoners created moments of profound existential confusion. Japanese servicemen found themselves forced to reconcile their direct experience of American medical care with everything they'd been taught about American cruelty. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Some resolved it by deciding they'd been captured by an atypical unit, that surely the torture would begin soon. Others began the painful process of questioning the foundational narratives of their military service. The symbolism of the medical kit became, for many Japanese prisoners, the physical embodiment of this ideological contradiction. American military medical supplies were astonishingly abundant by Japanese standards. Morphine, sulfur drugs, plasma, bandages, antiseptics, all available in quantities that seemed almost wasteful. Japanese military medicine operated under severe resource constraints, exacerbated by American submarine warfare that destroyed supply lines. Japanese wounded often received minimal treatment, and supplies were reserved for those most likely to return to combat. The Bushido ethos actually discouraged excessive medical care for the severely wounded, as it was considered more honorable to die than to burden the unit with long-term casualties. So when Japanese prisoners saw American medics using precious morphine on enemy wounded, expending clean bandages and antibiotics on men who would never fight for America, it revealed something about American resource abundance that was almost obscene by Japanese standards. One captured Japanese officer, interviewed after the war, recalled, "They used more medical supplies on me in one day than my entire unit had been issued for a month. I thought it was a trick, that they were fattening me up for something. Then I realized, no, they just had that much." That's when I understood we'd lost the war. Not because of their weapons, but because they could afford to waste resources on keeping enemies alive. This realization, the understanding that America possessed such staggering material abundance that it could treat enemy wounded as well as its own, recurred throughout prisoner testimonies. It was one thing to know intellectually that America was an industrial power. It was another to experience that power translated into the mundane details of captivity: 3 meals a day, clean water, medical care, clothing, soap. Japanese soldiers, who'd often been on half rations for months, who'd watched comrades die of preventable diseases, who'd been told that American troops were on the verge of collapse, suddenly found themselves in prisoner camps where the food, while not luxurious, was regular and sufficient. One prisoner, a soldier captured on Saipan, later wrote, "The American guards gave us rice, vegetables, some fish. Not a lot, but every day, reliably. I hadn't eaten every day in 6 months. My first thought was that this was a temporary kindness before they killed us, but it kept happening. Days became weeks. They just kept feeding us. That's when I realized the war was already over. We were fighting a nation that could feed its enemies." The psychological transformation that occurred in Japanese prisoner camps was profound and well documented. Initial terror gave way to confusion, then to a kind of guilty relief, and finally, for many, to a fundamental reconsideration of the narratives they'd been told. The treatment wasn't perfect. American guards were often hostile, sometimes abusive. Racial prejudice was endemic. Interrogations could be harsh, but the baseline expectation, systematic torture and execution, didn't materialize. Instead, prisoners found themselves in a legal and bureaucratic system that, however imperfectly, recognized them as human beings with certain protections. They received mail. They could send letters home, censored, but delivered. They were allowed to form work details for pay. They attended educational classes. They played sports. The mundane normalcy of captivity was, in its own way, more devastating to Japanese ideology than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they'd been prepared for. Bureaucratic indifference to their status as enemies. The simple fact that the American system categorized them as prisoners requiring processing rather than subhumans requiring elimination. That undermined everything they'd been taught about both the enemy and themselves. Asterisk the tears that Japanese prisoners shed. The weeping that American medics and guards repeatedly noted in their reports and diaries was not simply relief at survival. It was grief. For the collapse of meaning. These men had organized their entire lives around loyalty to the emperor, belief in Japanese spiritual superiority, and acceptance of death as preferable to dishonor. And then they found themselves alive, treated with basic medical care, fed regularly, and forced to confront the possibility that they'd been lied to about nearly everything. Some prisoners clung desperately to the old narratives, insisting that their treatment was an aberration or a trick. But many others began the painful process of ideological transformation. They started learning English. They attended the educational programs that American authorities offered, programs explicitly designed to introduce democratic principles and undermine emperor worship. They watched American films, read American books. and gradually absorbed a worldview in which individual human life had intrinsic value, independent of service to the state. This process was neither simple nor universal. Many prisoners remained bitter, convinced that Japan had been right and America simply more powerful. But a significant number experienced what post-war psychologists would call value reorientation, a fundamental shift in their understanding of political legitimacy, human rights, and the relationship between the individual and the state. The American medics themselves, men like Robert Chun who treated enemy wounded with the same professionalism they'd give to fellow Americans, were participating in a larger tradition that they often didn't fully articulate. The Geneva Conventions codified principles of medical neutrality and prisoner treatment that emerged from centuries of European warfare, principles that assumed even enemies shared common humanity. The United States military, despite its many failures to live up to these ideals, had institutionalized these principles in training, regulation, and disciplinary codes. Medics were taught that their obligation was to medical need, not national allegiance. This wasn't pacifism or softness. Medics often fought alongside combat troops, and the Pacific War was savage. But there was a clear distinction between killing enemy soldiers in combat and treating them once they were wounded and captured. That distinction was legal, ethical, and practical. Legally, the Geneva Conventions required it. Ethically, the American cultural framework recognized that warfare had limits. Practically, treating enemy wounded encouraged surrenders, which saved American lives. All these factors combined to create a system where a medic would genuinely prioritize a Japanese pilot's sucking chest wound over an American sailor's minor burns. Because that's what triage demanded. Japanese military culture had no equivalent framework. Japanese military medicine was sophisticated in many technical respects, but it operated within a value system where medical care was allocated based on military utility and social hierarchy. Officers received better care than enlisted men. Those likely to return to combat received priority over those who weren't. An enemy wounded received nothing, because they'd already forfeited any claim to care through the act of opposing Japan. This wasn't secret or hypocritical. It was explicit policy. Japanese medical personnel in occupied territories often participated directly in atrocities against prisoners and civilians, not as a violation of medical ethics but as an extension of military duty. The infamous Unit 731, which conducted biological warfare experiments on prisoners in Manchuria, was staffed by trained doctors and scientists who saw no contradiction between their medical training and their work. Within their framework, medical knowledge was a tool of the state to be used in service of Japanese victory. The concept of medical neutrality, of obligations to patients that transcended national allegiance, was simply absent. So when Japanese prisoners encountered American medics who embodied that principle, they were encountering not just different practices, but an entirely different philosophy of what medicine and humanity meant. The contrast became even starker. In the prisoner camps themselves, camp internment facilities across the United States, Hawaii, and various Pacific islands housed tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners by war's end. The conditions varied. Some camps were harsh, others relatively comfortable, but none resembled the death camps that Japanese propaganda had promised. Prisoners worked, studied, played baseball, formed orchestras, published camp newspapers, and engaged in the mundane routines of captive life. The American authorities, following established policy, allowed prisoners to organize their own internal governance, practice their religion, and maintain cultural traditions that didn't interfere with camp security. This was standard procedure, based on the principle that maintaining prisoner morale and order reduced security problems and complied with international law. But to Japanese prisoners expecting torture camps, it was astonishing. They found themselves in a system that was indifferent to their emperor worship, that neither demanded they renounce their beliefs, nor punished them for maintaining those beliefs. The ideological emptiness of American captivity, the fact that their captors didn't seem to care what they believed as long as they followed camp rules, was itself a kind of education in democratic principles. In Japan, the state demanded toto, ideological conformity. In America, the state demanded behavioral compliance, but left belief alone. That distinction, experienced daily in the camp routine, gradually eroded the totalitarian assumptions many prisoners had internalized. Letters, home from prisoners, heavily censored but eventually delivered through neutral countries, carried fragments of this transformation. Prisoners couldn't explicitly criticize the Japanese government or praise America. That would endanger their families. But they could describe their treatment in neutral terms. I am receiving medical care. The food is adequate. I am allowed to write letters. These simple statements, however bland, communicated something revolutionary to families in Japan. Their sons and husbands were alive, being treated according to recognizable standards of prisoner care, not tortured to death, as propaganda had insisted. After the war, when these prisoners returned to Japan, many faced severe social stigma for the dishonor of surrender. But they also carried direct experience of American society and values that complicated the simple narratives of victimization and American barbarism that some post-war Japanese political movements promoted. They knew, from personal experience, that Americans were capable of both great violence and basic decency. That the enemy was neither demon nor angel, but simply human, operating within a different cultural and political framework. This knowledge didn't necessarily make them pro-American. Many remained bitter about the war's outcome in Japan's occupation, but it made them resistant to the most extreme forms of anti-American propaganda, because they could point to their own experience and say, no, that's not accurate. Whatever else they were, they weren't that. The recurring image, across hundreds of testimonies and memoirs, is the moment of receiving medical care, the morphine injection, the clean bandage, the cup of water. These small acts of professional medical practice became, in the retelling, symbolic moments where ideology confronted reality, and reality won. Japanese veterans in the decades after the war would describe those moments with remarkable consistency. The expectation of death, the shock of care, the confusion, the slow dawning realization that perhaps everything they'd been told was incomplete or distorted. Some described it as liberation, the shedding of false beliefs. Others described it as loss, the collapse of meaning and purpose. For most, it was probably both. The old certainties had provided structure and purpose, even when they demanded death. The new uncertainty offered life but required them to rebuild their understanding of the world from scratch. It was not an easy exchange, even when it was necessary. American military personnel, for their part, rarely understood the full psychological impact of their actions. To the medic treating a wounded Japanese pilot, it was simply duty, following training and regulations. To the guards administering a prisoner camp, it was a job, often a frustrating one. They weren't trying to convert anyone or prove ideological superiority. They were processing prisoners according to established procedures rooted in legal obligations and practical considerations. But the gap between American intentions and Japanese perceptions created a strange asymmetry. Americans treated prisoners decently because that's what the rules required. Japanese prisoners interpreted that treatment as evidence of either American strength, America could afford to be merciful, or American values. America believed even enemies had rights, or both. Both interpretations undermined the Japanese war narrative. If America was strong enough to be merciful, Japan had lost. If America's mercy reflected genuine values, then perhaps American democracy wasn't the corrupt weakness Japanese propaganda claimed. Either way, the foundation cracked. The medical treatment of enemy wounded was not unique to the American military. British, Canadian, and Australian forces generally followed similar Geneva Convention protocols. But the Pacific War, with its particular intensity and ideological character, made these encounters especially significant. The European theater, for all its horrors, still operated within a shared cultural framework where both sides recognized certain limits, however often violated. The Pacific War was, in many ways, a clash of civilizations. A collision between radically incompatible conceptions of honor, duty, and human value. When those conceptions met in the person of a wounded prisoner receiving medical care, something had to give. Usually, it was the Japanese conception that gave way. Because it was built on lies about American behavior, the direct experience disproved. The American conception, for all its contradictions and hypocrisies, at least matched the reality that prisoners experienced. America said it would treat prisoners according to certain standards, and generally, imperfectly, it did. Japan said America would torture prisoners to death, and generally, it didn't. That gap between promise and reality determined which narrative survived contact with experience in the years immediately following the war. As American occupation forces worked to rebuild Japan as a democratic nation, many former prisoners played unexpected roles in that transformation. They'd experienced American democracy not as political theory but as lived reality in the mundane workings of a prisoner camp. They'd seen how rules applied generally, not arbitrarily. They'd seen how individual rights, however limited in captivity, were still recognized and protected. They'd seen how authority could be exercised without requiring total ideological submission. These observations, formed in captivity, became resources for understanding the democratic reforms that occupation authorities imposed on Japan. Not all former prisoners became Democrats. Many remained skeptical or hostile, but enough had internalized enough of the American example that they could participate meaningfully in Japan's post-war transformation. Cliff explained to fellow Japanese that democracy wasn't simply a foreign imposition but a functional system with certain advantages. The medic who treated Takeshi Yamamoto's shoulder in June 1942 had no idea he was participating in that long transformation. He was just doing his job. But his job, multiplied across thousands of similar encounters, helped create the conditions for Japan's eventual embrace of democratic governance. The tears that Japanese prisoners wept were tears of many things: relief at unexpected survival, shame at having surrendered, confusion at kindness from the enemy, grief for lost certainties, gratitude for medical care, fear of an uncertain future. All these emotions mingled in those moments when wounded prisoners realized they would actually receive treatment, that the horror stories were false, that they might actually survive. American observers, medics and guards and interrogators, often noted those tears with discomfort or incomprehension. They didn't understand what they were witnessing: the collapse of an entire worldview, the shattering of ideological certainty, the forced confrontation with a reality that didn't match the narratives that had organized these men's lives. To Americans, it was just crying. To the Japanese prisoners, it was the outward sign of an inner revolution. The moment when everything they'd been taught revealed itself as inadequate or false. The Pacific War ended in August 1945, with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The prisoner camps emptied gradually over the following months as men were repatriated to a Japan they barely recognized, devastated by bombing, occupied by foreign troops, and beginning the long process of reconstruction under American supervision. Many former prisoners found themselves pariahs, stigmatized by the dishonor of surrender in a society still clinging to Bushido values. But some found opportunities in the new Japan, their experience of American captivity making them useful as translators, guides, and interpreters of American intentions to confuse Japanese civilians. They'd seen the conquerors up close, had been fed by them, treated by them, processed through their bureaucratic systems. They knew Americans weren't demons, which didn't make the occupation welcome but did make it comprehensible. And as the years passed, and Japan transformed from militarist empire to pacifist democracy, to economic powerhouse, those men who'd wept when American medics treated their wounds could look back and recognize that moment as the beginning of their own transformation. The first crack in the edifice of lies that had sent them to war. There is a persistent myth that warfare reveals truth, that combat strips away pretense and shows the world as it really is. This is mostly false. Warfare creates its own distortions, its own lies, its own fog that obscures reality as thoroughly as any propaganda. But occasionally, in small moments, something true does emerge. When a medic prioritizes medical need over national allegiance. When a wounded enemy receives the same care as a wounded friend. When the simple procedures of professional medicine take precedence over ideology and hatred. Something true about human value becomes visible. It doesn't end wars. It doesn't prevent atrocities. It doesn't make killing moral or suffering noble. But it establishes, in the midst of mechanized death, that some baseline of human dignity persists even across the lines of battle. The Japanese pilots who wept when treated by American medics weren't weeping because Americans were good or Japan was evil. They were weeping because reality had invaded their certainty. Because mercy had interrupted their expectation of cruelty. Because they'd been forced to recognize that the enemy was human, and therefore they themselves must be human too. Not the divine instruments of imperial will they'd been taught to believe. That recognition, purchased at the cost of so much suffering, was perhaps the one genuinely valuable truth the Pacific War produced. The rest was just death and waste, and the awful mathematics of industrial killing. But in the moment when a corpsman cleaned a wound and applied a bandage, when morphine eased pain, regardless of which flag the pilot had served, something approaching truth existed. Not justice, not resolution. Just the simple, revolutionary truth that enemy wounded are still wounded, still human, still deserving of care. It was such a small truth. But in that time and place, it was enough to shatter worlds.